The water was always too hot. That was the first thing David learned when he started working at Bellanot 3 years ago. The industrial dishwasher heated the water to temperatures that turned his hands red and made his fingers ache by the end of each shift. But he never complained. He needed this job. David worked in the back corner of the kitchen, tucked away where customers never saw him. His world was made of stainless steel sinks, endless racks of dirty plates, and the constant rhythm of scraping, rinsing, and stacking. The sounds of the kitchen surrounded him every night. Chefs shouting orders, pans clanging against burners, servers rushing in and out with trays balanced on their shoulders. But David barely existed to them. When servers dropped off their dirty dishes, they rarely made eye contact. The line cooks talked over him like he was a piece of furniture. Even after 3 years, half the staff didn't know his name. To them, he was just the dishwasher, the guy who kept the plates clean and stayed out of the way. What they didn't know was that David had a whole other life. A secret life that began every night after his shift ended at 11. He would hang up his apron, punch out on the time clock, and walk 3 blocks to the bus stop. The night air felt good after 8 hours in the steaming kitchen. He'd take the number 42 bus heading east, then transfer to the 16 going north. The journey took almost an hour, but David didn't mind. He used the time to rest his hands and prepare his mind for what came next. By 12:30, he'd arrive at a small music studio in a converted warehouse. The building was old and the elevator barely worked, but the practice rooms were cheap. $40 gave him 3 hours with an upright piano that had seen better days. The keys stuck sometimes, and it was always slightly out of tune, but it didn't matter. To David, that old piano was everything. He would sit on the worn bench, flex his fingers, and begin to play. Classical pieces mostly. Chopin, Beethoven, Rachmaninoff. His fingers would move across the keys like they were speaking a language his mouth couldn't form. All the frustration of being invisible, all the exhaustion from scrubbing dishes, all the dreams he'd buried deep inside would pour out through the music. David had learned to play as a child back in Taiwan. His mother had worked 2 jobs to pay for his lessons. She believed he had a gift, believed he could be someone important. He'd been accepted to one of the best music schools in Taipei. Everyone said he had a bright future, but life doesn't always follow the path you imagine. His father got sick. Medical bills piled up. The family decided to immigrate to America for better opportunities and treatment. David was 17. He told himself he'd continue his music training in the new country. He'd find a way. Instead, he found himself working to help support the family. First in a grocery store, then in a warehouse, then washing dishes. The years slipped by. His father passed away despite all their efforts. His mother grew older. The bills never stopped coming. His piano playing became something he did in secret, late at night when the rest of the world was sleeping. Nobody at the restaurant knew any of this. They saw a quiet man who kept his head down and did his job. They heard him humming sometimes while he worked, but who paid attention to that? David had learned not to talk about his past. People either didn't believe him or they looked at him with pity. Both reactions made him feel worse. So he kept scrubbing dishes and playing piano in the middle of the night and riding 2 buses each way. It was a lonely life, but it was his life. The music kept him going. Those 3 hours in the practice room were the only time he felt like himself. Tonight started like any other Thursday night at Bellanota. The restaurant was busy but not crazy. David worked through his usual mountain of dishes. Water running, machines humming, the familiar routine that his hands could do without thinking. But around 7 o'clock, something changed. The kitchen energy shifted. David could feel it even from his corner. Vincent, the restaurant owner, burst through the kitchen doors talking rapidly on his phone. His face was red and his voice kept getting louder. "What do you mean he's not coming? The gala starts in 2 hours. I have critics coming. I have donors. I have the mayor." Vincent was practically shouting into his phone. David kept washing dishes, but he was listening now. Everyone in the kitchen was listening. Vincent ended the call and looked like he might throw his phone across the room. The pianist canceled. Food poisoning. "The charity gala is tonight and we have no music." The head chef tried to calm him down. "Can you find a replacement?" "I've called everyone. Everyone's booked on a Thursday night. This is a disaster." Vincent started pacing, making more calls, getting more desperate with each conversation. David's heart started beating faster. He knew what was happening tonight. The big charity event. Important people. The kind of evening where everything had to be perfect. He'd seen the staff preparing all week. Extra flowers, special menus. The grand piano in the dining room had been tuned yesterday. That piano. David had noticed it the moment it arrived. A beautiful black Steinway that probably cost more than he made in 5 years. He'd walked past it when the dining room was empty, let his fingers brush across the closed lid, imagined what it would feel like to play such an instrument. What about the dishwasher? Someone said. David's hands froze in the soapy water. He looked up. Maria, one of the servers, was pointing in his direction. I've heard him humming classical music, like actual classical pieces. Maybe he plays. Vincent turned and really looked at David for perhaps the first time ever. His expression was doubtful. The dishwasher? This is a serious event, Maria. We have food critics from the Times coming. Jonathan Pierce will be here. The man who destroyed Luigi's restaurant with one review. I'm just saying, maybe ask him, Maria suggested. David could feel everyone's eyes on him now. His face felt hot. Part of him wanted to speak up, to say, yes, I can play, I've been training since I was 6 years old. But another part of him was terrified. What if he wasn't good enough? What if they laughed at him? What if he failed in front of all those important people? Vincent looked at David, then at his watch, then back at David. The kitchen had gone quiet except for the sound of simmering pots and the hum of the refrigerators. Can you play piano? Vincent asked, his voice heavy with skepticism.
Any piano at all?
This was it. The moment David had imagined 1,000 times in different ways. A chance to be seen. A chance to show people who he really was. His hands were still dripping dishwater. His white shirt was stained and damp. But underneath all of that was someone who spoke fluently in the language of music. David slowly dried his hands on a towel. He looked at Vincent and felt something shift inside his chest. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that felt like hope waking up after a very long sleep. Yes, he said quietly. I can play. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath. David's words hung in the air between him and Vincent. Yes, I can play. 3 simple words that felt like jumping off a cliff. Vincent stared at him for a long moment. David could see the calculation happening behind the restaurant owner's eyes. This was his dishwasher, a man who cleaned plates and kept quiet. Could he really trust him in front of the most important guest the restaurant had ever hosted? You understand what tonight is, right? Vincent said slowly. This isn't some casual dinner service. We have critics out there who can make or break restaurants with a single article. We have wealthy donors who write checks that keep charities running. The mayor is coming. These people expect excellence. David nodded. His heart was pounding so hard he wondered if others could hear it. I need background music, Vincent continued. Nothing too loud, nothing flashy. Just pleasant piano music that people can talk over. Can you do that? Do you know enough songs? Something twisted inside David's chest at those words. Background music. Something to be ignored. But he understood. This was Vincent's restaurant, his reputation, his risk. David was asking to be trusted based on nothing but a quiet confession. I know enough songs, David said. Vincent checked his watch again. The first guests arrive in 45 minutes. You've got 15 minutes to clean up and prove you can do this. If you can't, I'll just apologize to everyone and we'll go without music. David pulled off his rubber gloves. His hands were wrinkled and red from the hot water, but they would have to do. He untied his apron and hung it on the hook where it had hung for 3 years. Underneath, his white shirt was damp with sweat and splashed with water. It would have to do too. He followed Vincent through the kitchen. The other staff members watched him pass. Some looked curious. Others looked skeptical. One of the line cooks muttered something under his breath that David didn't quite catch, but the tone was clear. Nobody believed the dishwasher could pull this off. The dining room looked like something from a magazine. White tablecloths so crisp they could cut paper. Crystal glasses catching the light from small chandeliers. Fresh flowers on every table. And there, in the corner by the windows, sat the piano. David had seen it before, but always from a distance. Now he walked right up to it. The piano was even more beautiful up close. The black lacquer finish reflected the room like a mirror. He lifted the fallboard and looked at the keys. Perfect. Pristine. This instrument probably cost more than everything David owned combined. Well, Vincent said, show me what you can do. David sat on the bench. It was adjusted too low for him, but there wasn't time to fix it. He placed his hands on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth under his fingertips. For just a second, he closed his eyes. This was real. This was happening. After 3 years of being invisible, someone was finally asking him to be seen. He started with something simple, a piece by Eric Satie called Gymnopédie No. 1. It was gentle and melancholic, the kind of music that floated through a room without demanding attention. His fingers found the notes easily. This was a piece he'd played 1,000 times in that tiny practice room. The piano responded beautifully. Every note sang clearly. The sound filled the dining room with a warmth that made the space feel alive. David let the music flow through him, forgetting for a moment about Vincent standing behind him, forgetting about the important guests who would soon arrive. When he finished, there was silence. David turned around, afraid of what he might see on Vincent's face. The restaurant owner looked stunned. His mouth hung open slightly. Behind him, Maria and 2 other servers had gathered near the kitchen door. They were all staring. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Vincent asked quietly. "Taiwan. A long time ago," David said. He didn't elaborate. There wasn't time for his whole story. Vincent ran his hand through his hair. Okay, this could work. But I need you presentable. Maria, find him something better to wear. Maybe one of Carlo's spare dress shirts. And David, wash your face, fix your hair. You've got 30 minutes. The next half hour passed in a blur. Maria found him a black dress shirt that was slightly too big but looked decent when tucked in. Someone loaned him a black tie. David washed his face and hands in the bathroom, scrubbing away the smell of dish soap. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. He looked like someone who belonged at a piano. Not a dishwasher. A musician. By the time he returned to the dining room, the first guests were arriving. David could hear their voices in the entrance. The sound of expensive coats being checked, heels clicking on the marble floor. His stomach twisted with nerves. "Remember," Vincent said, appearing at his elbow. "Background music. Don't draw attention to yourself. Just play nice and easy and we'll all get through this evening." David took his seat at the piano. From this position, he could see most of the dining room. Tables were filling up now. Men in dark suits. Women in elegant dresses. Everyone looked wealthy and important. They spoke in confident voices about things David couldn't quite hear. He began to play. More Satie, then some light Chopin. Pieces that were technically challenging but sounded effortless. The kind of music that created atmosphere without asking to be noticed. David kept his head down, focused on the keys, trying to disappear even while sitting in plain sight. The room filled steadily. Waiters glided between tables with trays of appetizers and wine. Conversations rose and fell like waves. David played on, one piece flowing into the next. His hands knew these songs so well he didn't have to think about them. Muscle memory took over while his mind wandered. This was what he'd dreamed about for so long. Not washing dishes in the back, this. Playing for people. Being a musician. But even now, even sitting at this beautiful piano in his borrowed shirt, he was still invisible. Background music. Don't draw attention. Just blend in. Then he saw them arrive. A group of 4 people who created a small stir when they entered. Vincent rushed over to greet them personally. David recognized one of them immediately, even though they'd never met. Jonathan Pierce, the food critic from the New York Times. The man Vincent had mentioned with such worry in his voice. Pierce was younger than David expected, maybe in his early 40s. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself like someone who knew his opinion mattered. The people with him seemed to hang on his every word as they were shown to a premium table near the center of the room. As they passed the piano, Pierce glanced over. His eyes swept across David dismissively, the way you might look at a piece of furniture or a lamp. Then he said something to his companions that David couldn't hear, but he saw them laugh. Not a kind laugh, a mocking one. David felt his face grow hot. He knew that look. He'd seen it countless times in his 3 years of washing dishes. The look that said you don't matter. You're not worth noticing. You're just the help. Something shifted inside him then. A door that had been closed for 3 years began to crack open. He thought about all those nights riding 2 buses to play piano in a tiny room. All those hours practicing pieces that nobody heard. All that talent that went unnoticed because he'd learned to make himself small. Background music, Vincent had said. Don't draw attention, but David's fingers had other ideas. They were tired of being background, tired of being invisible, tired of playing quiet and safe while the world looked right through him. He finished the gentle Debussy piece he'd been playing. Then instead of moving to another soft melody, his hands found different keys, bolder keys. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The sound that came from the piano was not background music. It was a declaration. It was powerful and dramatic and impossible to ignore. David pressed into the keys, letting all his frustration and longing pour out. The music swelled through the dining room like a wave. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. David didn't stop. He couldn't stop. 3 years of silence were breaking open, and the only language that could express it was music. His fingers flew across the keys, finding notes he'd practiced until they lived in his bones. The Rachmaninoff demanded everything from him, and he gave it willingly. This was no longer about background music or staying invisible. This was about being seen, finally completely undeniably seen. The dining room transformed in seconds. The busy chatter that had filled the space just moments ago died away like someone had turned down the volume on the world. Forks stopped moving. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Even the waiters slowed their steps, all because of the music coming from the piano in the corner. David's fingers moved across the keys with the kind of precision that only comes from years of dedicated practice. The Rachmaninoff piece was technically brutal, full of complicated runs and dramatic shifts, but his hands knew every note. They'd practiced this piece hundreds of times, in that small rented room at midnight when the city was sleeping. Now, those same hands were playing for a room full of people who had no idea who he was or what he'd sacrificed to keep his music alive. From the kitchen doorway, Vincent stood frozen. His face had gone pale. This wasn't what he'd asked for. This wasn't pleasant background music. This was a full performance, loud and passionate and impossible to ignore. Vincent looked like a man watching his careful plans catch fire, but he didn't stop it. Maybe he was too shocked. Or maybe deep down he knew that stopping it would be wrong. At the center table, Jonathan Pierce had been lifting his wine glass when the music began. The glass remained suspended in the air, forgotten. His expression had changed completely. The smug dismissiveness was gone. In its place was something like disbelief. "Who is that playing?" asked the woman sitting next to him, a gallery owner named Rebecca. Pierce shook his head slowly. "I have no idea. But whoever they are, they shouldn't be working in a restaurant. They should be performing at Carnegie Hall." David couldn't hear their conversation. He was lost in the music now, in that place where nothing else existed except the piano and the notes flowing from it. This piece had always spoken to him on a deep level. It was about longing and passion and the ache of wanting something beautiful that seemed just out of reach. He thought about his mother as he played. How she'd worked 2 jobs to pay for his lessons. How proud she'd been when he got accepted to music school. How disappointed she must have been when life got in the way of those dreams. She never said it out loud, but David knew. He saw it in her eyes whenever she asked about his job at the restaurant. The music swelled into its most dramatic section. David's whole body moved with the piece now. His shoulders swayed. His head dipped and rose. This wasn't just his fingers playing anymore. It was everything he had. In the back corner of the dining room, an older woman dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. The music had reached something inside her, pulled out an emotion she didn't know she was carrying. She wasn't the only one. Several other guests sat with glassy eyes, completely captured by what they were hearing. The mayor, seated near the window, had stopped talking to his aide entirely. He leaned back in his chair and simply listened. He'd been to hundreds of these charity events over the years. They all blended together after a while. The same speeches, the same food, the same forgettable background music. But this was different. This was something real. David transitioned from the Rachmaninoff into something of his own creation. He'd never written music down on paper, but he improvised sometimes during his late-night practice sessions. His fingers found those patterns now, mixing classical techniques with jazz harmonies. He wove in fragments of melodies from his childhood in Taiwan ski songs his grandmother used to sing. The piece became a story. His story. The journey from a hopeful boy with a gift to a man washing dishes in the back of a restaurant. But also the hope that never quite died. The music that kept playing in his head even when no one else could hear it. The dream that refused to be buried completely, no matter how many years passed. Maria stood near the kitchen door with tears streaming down her face. She'd worked at Bella Nata for 5 years. She'd seen David almost every shift during the past 3 years. They'd exchanged pleasantries, talked about the weather, shared the occasional complaint about difficult customers. But she'd never really known him. None of them had. They'd never bothered to ask. Now she was seeing who he really was, and it broke her heart a little. How many other people in her life had she looked past? How many other stories had she never heard because she didn't think to listen? The head chef, Carlo, had come out of the kitchen too. He stood with his arms crossed, but his eyes were wide. He'd always been short with David, treating him like the least important person on staff. Now he couldn't look away. The music demanded respect in a way that words never could. David played for nearly 20 minutes straight. His piece flowed from one movement to another, sometimes quiet and contemplative, sometimes explosive and powerful. His hands were starting to ache. The old injury in his left wrist from a childhood fall began to throb. But he pushed through it. This moment wouldn't come again. He had to give it everything. Jonathan Pierce pulled out his phone. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing notes. His usual restaurant review would have to wait. This was a different kind of story altogether. The kind that his readers would actually care about. Not another critique of overpriced pasta or underwhelming wine lists, but something human. Something that reminded people why art mattered. "This is incredible," Rebecca whispered to him.
How is this man not famous?
"I intend to find out," Pierce replied, still typing. Vincent had moved from the kitchen door into the dining room now. He walked slowly along the wall, looking at his guests. Everyone was captivated. Not a single person was checking their phone or looking bored. The energy in the room had completely shifted. This wasn't just a charity dinner anymore. It was an event they would remember, and it was all because of his dishwasher. The quiet man he'd never bothered to really see. Vincent felt a strange mixture of emotions. Pride, because this was happening in his restaurant. Shame, because he dismissed David so quickly when the crisis began. And something else too. A realization that he'd been running his business while missing what was right in front of him. How many other staff members had stories he'd never heard? How many had talents and dreams and complicated lives that he'd never asked about, because he was too busy managing the surface of things? David's playing began to soften. He was approaching the end, bringing all the themes together into a gentle resolution. The final notes rang out clear and pure, then faded into silence. His hands lifted from the keys and rested in his lap. His shoulders slumped slightly. The adrenaline that had carried him through the performance was starting to drain away, leaving exhaustion in its place. For a moment, nothing happened. The dining room remained silent. David stared at the piano keys, suddenly afraid to turn around. What if they'd hated it? What if he'd ruined Vincent's important evening? What if that critical voice was right, and he really should have just stayed in the back washing dishes? Then someone started clapping. Slow at first, just one person. Then another joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire dining room was applauding. But it wasn't polite, obligatory applause. It was real, enthusiastic. People weren't just clapping with their hands. They were rising from their seats, a standing ovation. For the dishwasher, David finally turned around. His eyes were wet. He couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. All these important people, these critics and donors and politicians, standing and applauding for him. Some were shouting bravo, others were wiping their eyes. The room had come alive with appreciation and respect. Jonathan Pierce was clapping harder than anyone, a broad smile across his face. The same face that had looked at David with casual dismissal just 30 minutes earlier. Vincent was clapping too, and when he caught David's eye across the room, he mouthed two words that David could read clearly on his lips. "I'm sorry." Maria was crying and clapping at the same time. Carlo nodded at him with something that looked like respect. The entire staff who had gathered to watch were celebrating like David had just won a championship. David stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs. He gave a small, awkward bow. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to being seen, wasn't used to people caring about what he could do. For 3 years he'd been invisible. Now he felt like he was standing in the spotlight for the first time in his life. The applause continued. People moved toward him, wanting to talk, to congratulate, to ask questions. David felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. But underneath the overwhelm was something else, something warm and bright that he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Real hope. The kind that didn't die at midnight in a practice room. The kind that lived in daylight in front of witnesses, in a world that was finally ready to listen. The applause finally began to fade, but the energy in the room remained electric. David stood beside the piano, unsure what to do with his hands. People were approaching him now. Real people, important people, and they wanted to talk to him. The first person to reach him was Jonathan Pierce. Up close, the food critic looked different than he had from across the room. His eyes were bright with genuine excitement. He extended his hand and David shook it, still feeling like he was living in a dream. "That was extraordinary," Pierce said. "Truly extraordinary. Where did you train?" "Juilliard, Curtis? Taipei National University of the Arts," David answered quietly. His voice felt strange in his throat. He wasn't used to talking about his past, but that was a long time ago. Pierce pulled out his phone again. "I need to get your story. Your full story. I write about restaurants for the Times, but this is different. People need to hear about this. Would you be willing to talk with me? Maybe tomorrow?" David nodded, not quite trusting himself to speak. Tomorrow felt like a concept from another universe. He was still trying to process what had just happened tonight. The mayor came next, pumping David's hand enthusiastically. "Young man, that was the best thing I've heard in years. We need to talk about having you perform at some city events. Here's my card." Then came Rebecca, the gallery owner. "I organize cultural events all over the city. Private concerts, fundraisers, openings. I'd love to have you play. We pay very well." The cards kept coming. A music school director, a concert promoter, a woman who ran a luxury hotel and wanted a pianist for their lobby bar. David's pockets filled with business cards from people who, an hour ago, wouldn't have noticed if he'd walked right past them. Through it all, Vincent watched from near the kitchen. His initial panic had transformed into something more complicated. He should have felt happy. His restaurant was hosting what would clearly become the talk of the city. But mostly he felt small. He'd employed this man for 3 years. 3 years. And he'd never once asked him about his life. When the crowd around David finally thinned, Vincent made his way over. They stood facing each other in awkward silence for a moment. "I'm sorry," Vincent said again, this time out loud where everyone could hear. "I should have asked. I should have seen you." David didn't know what to say to that. Part of him wanted to be angry about the 3 years of being invisible. But another part understood. People got busy. They got caught up in their own problems. They stopped seeing the humans behind the job titles. "It's okay," David said. And he mostly meant it. "No, it's not," Vincent replied. "But I want to make it right. You're not washing dishes anymore. I want you to play piano here. Real performances. 3 nights a week. I'll pay you what I should have been paying you all along." David's breath caught. A real job. Playing piano. At a salary that might actually let him quit the dish station. It was more than he'd dared to hope for. "Think about it," Vincent said. "I know you'll have other offers now. Better offers, probably. But if you want a regular place to play while you figure things out, it's yours." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. David played a few more pieces, gentler ones this time. The guests ate their dinners and made their donations to the charity. But the whole night had a different feeling now. People kept glancing over at the piano, at the man in the borrowed shirt who had transformed their evening. When the last guests finally left around 11, David was exhausted. His hands ached. His back hurt from sitting at the piano bench. But his heart felt lighter than it had in years. The staff gathered in the dining room after closing. Usually everyone rushed to leave, tired from a long shift. But tonight they lingered. They wanted to talk to David, to really talk to him. "How long have you been playing?" Maria asked. "Since I was 6, David said. "My mother wanted me to learn." She said Music was a universal language. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Carlo asked. There was no judgment in his voice, just genuine curiosity. David thought about how to answer that. "I guess I stopped believing anyone would care. When you're just the dishwasher, people don't usually ask about your dreams." The words hung in the air. Everyone in that room understood what he meant. They all had their own stories, their own dreams that got pushed aside by bills and responsibilities in the daily grind of survival. "I used to dance," Maria said quietly. "Ballet. I was pretty good too. But I had to quit to help my family." "I haven't told anyone that in years," Carlo nodded. "I wanted to be a painter. Still do, actually. I paint sometimes on my days off, but nobody knows about it." One by one, the staff began sharing pieces of themselves they usually kept hidden. The sous chef who wrote poetry, the server who was taking online classes to become a therapist, the bartender who volunteered at an animal shelter every weekend. They all had full lives beyond these walls, but they'd learned to keep those lives separate, to show up, do the work, and keep the rest private. David realized something important as he listened. He wasn't the only invisible person. Everyone felt unseen in their own way. The difference was that tonight, for whatever reason, he'd been given a chance to be visible. And maybe that meant others could be seen too. He went home that night on the same 2 buses he always took. But everything felt different. His phone kept buzzing with messages. Pierce had already sent him 3 emails asking for an interview. The concert promoter wanted to meet next week. Even his mother had called, somehow having heard about the evening from a friend who knew someone who was there. David sat on the bus and looked at all the business cards in his hands. They represented possibilities he'd stopped letting himself imagine. Real performances, steady work as a musician, a life where his talent wasn't something he practiced in secret, but something he shared with the world. But one card stuck out from the rest. It was simple, just a name and number, Jonathan Pierce, New York Times. On the back, Pierce had written a note in quick handwriting, "Your story matters. Let me help you tell it." When David got home, his apartment felt smaller than usual, or maybe he felt bigger. He sat on his bed and just breathed for a while, letting the evening wash over him. Part of him worried that he'd wake up tomorrow and find out it was all a dream, that he'd still be just the invisible dishwasher that nobody noticed. His phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. "Hi David, this is Rebecca from Tonight. I organize a concert series for emerging artists. I'd love to feature you in our spring showcase at the Symphony Center. It seats 2,000 people. Interested?" 2,000 people. David's hand started shaking. He set the phone down and walked to his window. The city stretched out before him, millions of lights in the darkness. Somewhere out there were 2,000 empty seats waiting to be filled, and maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to fill them. He thought about his mother, about all those piano lessons she'd sacrificed for, about his younger self, so full of hope and dreams, who'd gotten on a plane to America believing anything was possible. That boy had gotten lost somewhere along the way, buried under years of disappointment and invisible work. But tonight that boy had come back. He'd sat at a beautiful piano and reminded the world and himself that he was still here. Still dreaming, still capable of creating something beautiful. David picked up his phone and replied to Rebecca's message. Just one word, but it felt like the most important word he'd ever written. Yes. Then he texted Vincent too. The restaurant owner had given him his number on the way out, made him promise to think about the offer to play regularly at Bella Notte. "I'll take the job," David wrote. "Thank you for giving me a chance." The response came back almost immediately. "No, thank you for reminding me to look beyond what I think I see. You start Friday." "And David?" "No more dishes ever," David smiled. He set his phone on the nightstand and lay back on his bed. Tomorrow he'd call Pierce and tell his story. He'd meet with the concert promoter and the music school director. He'd start planning for a future that actually looked like the one he'd always wanted. But tonight he just wanted to feel this moment. To hold on to the memory of a room full of strangers standing and applauding, of being seen, really seen, finally seen. His hand still ached from playing. It was a good ache. The kind that meant something real had happened. The kind that meant he was alive and using his gifts instead of hiding them away. Outside his window, the city hummed with late-night energy. Somewhere out there, someone else was probably washing dishes and dreaming of something more. Someone else was playing music in an empty room, wondering if anyone would ever care. Someone else was invisible, waiting for their moment to be seen. David closed his eyes and sent a silent thought out into that city. Hold on, keep practicing. Keep hoping. Your moment might come when you least expect it. And when it does, don't hold back. Play like everything depends on it, because maybe it does. 3 days later, Jonathan Pierce's article went live on the New York Times website. The headline read, "The Dishwasher Who Played Like a Dream. One Man's Journey from Invisible to Unforgettable." David was at his mother's apartment when it published. He'd taken the day off from the restaurant, his first day off in months. They sat together at her small kitchen table, his laptop open between them. His mother's hands trembled as she scrolled through the article, reading every word. Pierce had written beautifully about that night at Bellinot. But more than that, he'd told David's whole story. The childhood lessons, the acceptance to music school, the difficult decision to immigrate, the years of working to support his family while his musical dreams gathered dust, the midnight practice sessions that nobody knew about, and finally, that one extraordinary night when everything changed. He says you reminded him why he fell in love with music in the first place, his mother said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked up from the screen with tears in her eyes. I'm so proud of you. I'm sorry it took so long, David said quietly. She reached across the table and took his hand. You never stopped playing. That's what matters. Even when life was hard, even when nobody was listening, you never stopped. That takes strength. By the afternoon, the article had been shared thousands of times. David's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. More messages, more offers. A television station wanted to interview him. A podcast about pursuing dreams wanted him as a guest. Someone had even found an old video of him performing at a student recital in Taiwan and posted it online. The comments were full of people saying they couldn't believe this talented young man had been washing dishes for 3 years. But not everyone understood. Some comments asked why he'd wasted his time at such a meaningless job. Others questioned why he hadn't tried harder to pursue music. A few said the whole thing seemed too perfect, too much like a fairy tale to be real. David tried not to read the negative comments, but they stuck with him anyway. These people didn't understand that life wasn't simple, that sometimes you made choices between your dreams and your family's survival, that sometimes washing dishes was the most meaningful thing you could do because it kept a roof over your mother's head and food on her table. On Friday night, David returned to Bellinata, but this time he walked through the front entrance instead of the back door. Vincent met him there with a genuine smile. Ready for your first official performance? Vincent asked. The dining room had been rearranged slightly. The piano had been moved to a more prominent position. There was now a small spotlight above it. A printed card on each table announced, Special Guest Piani. Ist, David Chen, performing nightly, Friday through Sunday. David's heart raced as he saw his name in print like that. David Chen, pianist, not dishwasher, not invisible kitchen staff. A real musician with a real position. The evening crowd was different too. Word had spread about the dishwasher pianist. Many people had come specifically to hear him play. The tables filled quickly and Vincent had to turn people away. He told David they'd already received dozens of reservations for the following weeks. When David sat at the piano that night, he felt different than he had during the charity gala. That night had been spontaneous, fueled by years of pent-up frustration and need. Tonight was intentional. This was his job now. His actual job. Playing music for people who wanted to hear it. He started with the piece that had launched everything. The Rachmaninoff. The crowd responded just as enthusiastically as they had before. But this time David was prepared for it. He let himself enjoy their appreciation instead of feeling overwhelmed by it. Between sets, people approached him. Some asked for autographs, which felt surreal. Others wanted to share their own stories of deferred dreams and difficult choices. A middle-aged woman told him she'd quit her accounting job to go back to school for art therapy after reading about him. A young man said he'd been too scared to audition for a local theater, but David's story gave him courage to try. This was the part David hadn't expected. He thought the story ended with him finally being seen as a musician. But the story had grown bigger than that. It had become about anyone who'd ever felt invisible. Anyone who'd ever had to choose between dreams and duty. Anyone who'd ever kept practicing something in secret, hoping that someday someone would care. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind. David performed at Bellinata 3 nights a week, always to packed crowds. On his off nights, he took other gigs. The hotel lobby Rebecca had mentioned. A private party for a tech company. A benefit concert at a community center. The music school director offered him a teaching position, working with students who showed promise but couldn't afford traditional lessons. David accepted immediately. He remembered being that kid, the one whose talent might have been wasted if his mother hadn't sacrificed everything to nurture it. 2 months after that night at the charity gala, David performed at Rebecca's spring showcase at the Symphony Center. 2,000 seats just like she'd promised. He stood backstage before the show, peeking out at the filling auditorium. His mother sat in the third row dressed in her best outfit. Vincent and Maria were there too, along with several other staff from Bella Notte. Even Carlo had come, bringing his wife. But what made David's throat tight with emotion was seeing some people he didn't know personally. People who'd read the article, people who'd seen his story shared online, people who'd decided his music was worth leaving their houses and buying tickets to hear. They believed in him before he'd even played a note. When he walked onto that stage, the applause was deafening. David sat at the grand piano, even more beautiful than the one at Bella Notte. He adjusted the bench and placed his hands on the keys. Then he looked out at those 2,000 faces and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about proving himself anymore. It wasn't about being seen or recognized or validated. It was simply about sharing something beautiful with people who wanted to receive it. The music had always been enough. He'd just forgotten that for a while. He played for 90 minutes that night. Classical pieces mixed with his own improvisations. Music that told stories without words. Music that connected him to every person in that auditorium through the universal language his mother had told him about all those years ago. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. David took his bows, overwhelmed and grateful. But the best moment came after, when he found his mother backstage. She wrapped him in a tight hug and whispered in his ear in Mandarin, "Your father would have been so proud. I wish he could have seen this." "He did," David said. "He always believed I'd find my way back to music. Even when I didn't believe it myself. Life didn't become perfect after that night." David still worried about money sometimes. He still had moments of doubt, wondering if his success was temporary. The practice room he'd rented for so long remained part of his routine. He went there late at night not because he had to anymore, but because he wanted to. Because that small room represented something important. It was where he'd kept his dream alive when no one else knew it existed. 6 months after the charity gala, David ran into Jonathan Pierce at a coffee shop. The critic was working on his laptop, probably writing another review that would make or break some restaurant. "How's everything going?" Pierce asked, genuinely interested. "Good," David said. "Really good. I'm teaching at the music school. Playing regular gigs. I even have an agent now, which still feels weird to say." Pierce smiled. "You know what the best part of your story is? It's not the dramatic discovery or the standing ovation. It's that you never stopped practicing. 3 years of washing dishes, and you still rode 2 buses every night to play piano in an empty room. That's the real story. The dedication that nobody saw." David thought about that on his way home. Pierce was right. The night at Bella Notte had changed his circumstances, but it hadn't changed who he was. He was the same person who'd spent 3 years being invisible, working hard, and refusing to let his music die even when it seemed pointless. The difference now was that people could see what had always been there. The talent, the dedication, the dream that survived despite everything. But David had learned something important through all of this. Being seen was wonderful. Having your talent recognized and appreciated was a gift. But the music itself, the act of creating something beautiful, whether anyone was watching or not, that was what really mattered. He still washed his own dishes at home, by the way. It reminded him where he'd come from. Plus, there was something meditative about the routine, the hot water, the simple task, the quiet moment before sitting down to practice. Some nights when he played piano now, David thought about that dish station at Bella Notte, about the version of himself who'd worked there, invisible and overlooked. He felt grateful to that man. That man had kept the music alive. That man had never given up, even when giving up would have been easier. And sometimes, when David performed in front of large audiences, he remembered what his mother had said that day in her kitchen. "You never stopped playing." That was the real triumph. Not the applause or the recognition or the career opportunities. It was the refusal to let his dream die completely. It was the choice to keep practicing even when no one was listening. Because the truth was, someone had always been listening. He had been listening. And in the end, that had been enough to keep him going until the rest of the world was ready to hear what he had to say. The music had saved him. But maybe in some small way he had saved the music too, by keeping it alive in the darkness. By believing in it when belief seemed foolish. By playing for audiences of one in the middle of the night, preparing for a moment he didn't know was coming. That was the real story. Not about overnight success, but about the years of unseen work that made one special night possible. About the dreams we keep alive in secret, hoping that someday the world will care enough to listen. And when that day finally comes, we're ready. Because we never stopped playing.